In these next few videos, we're going to look at a new way or a different way of solving a system of equations called elimination. And just to review, when we have an equation that has multiple variables in the equation, so for instance in this first equation we have an x and a y, and also in the second equation we have an x and a y, it is impossible to determine what the value of x is or what the value of y is as long as both variables are in the equation. The only way to determine the value of any variable is if that is the only variable that appears in the equation. And so in the previous lessons we learned how to use substitution, and you'll notice that if I use substitution on this particular system, as I rewrote the equation and then when I come to y here, substitute in this new or equivalent expression, you'll notice that this equation that had two variables in it to begin with now only has the letter x in it. So by substituting this equal expression in, I was able to create an equation that had just one variable in it, and then through my steps of solving an equation I was able to determine what the value of x actually is. And then once I knew that, I was able to substitute that back into this equation, giving me just numbers on this side, which allowed me to determine the value of y. In either case, the only way for me to determine the value of the variable was if that was the only letter in the equation. So substitution was one way of doing that. Elimination is another way of doing that exact same thing, of eliminating one of the two different variables in the expression so that I can determine the value of a variable. Now, the elimination method is simply an application of one property of numbers that we call opposites or additive inverses. And opposites or additive inverses simply say that when you add opposites together, the sum of those two numbers is 0. So if I take the number 4 and add to it its opposite or its additive inverse, that's going to equal 0. So 4 plus negative 4 is 0. If I extend this just a little bit further to variables or like terms, if I have 4 and negative 4x, they are opposite, that also equals 0. So we're going to use this fact that opposites add up to 0 in order to eliminate one of the two variables from the system, allowing me to determine the value of the remaining variable. So now we know what we need to do is get one variable in the equation, and we know how we're going to do it by using opposites. Let's give you 4 steps on how to do elimination real quickly. When you're doing elimination, the first thing that you're going to want to do is to put all the equations in standard form, and that will line up our variables for us. And then we want to look for opposite coefficients. So we'll have the x's lined up, and we'll have the y terms lined up, and we'll have the constants because we'll be in standard form. So then we'll be able to see whether we have opposite coefficients or not. If we have opposite coefficients, we can go ahead right to the last step, and that is to go ahead and add those equations together. And in doing so, the coefficients or the variables that have opposite coefficients will be eliminated, and we'll be able to determine the value of the variable that's left. Let's say we look for opposite coefficients and we don't have opposite coefficients. Well, then what we're going to need to do is to look and see if we can't multiply one equation by a number that's going to create opposites. And again, we'll do some examples here so you see that. But if we can, we'll go ahead and multiply that equation by that one number, and that means we multiply every term in the equation by that number, which will give us opposites, which means we can then go to step 4, which would be adding those equations together and thus eliminating the one variables that now have opposites. If we get them in standard form and we don't have opposite coefficients and we can't multiply one equation by one number that gives me an opposite, we may need to then multiply both equations by different numbers that will create opposite coefficients either for the x or for the y. So that will be about the most challenging that we'll have to do, is multiplying both equations by different numbers. But again, the goal here is simply to create opposites. Once we have opposites, we go ahead to number 4. We'll add those equations together. Because we have opposite coefficients, that one variable will be eliminated, and we'll be able to determine the value of the remaining variable. So that's a quick explanation of those of the elimination method. We're In the next video, we'll take a look at some examples from the first worksheet where we have opposite coefficients, and then we'll work our way up to the more complicated ones.